Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. So my name is Emmanuel Echampon. I'm a professor of history and of African studies, and I direct the Center for African Studies. And I'll serve as moderator for this panel, which is on financing the energy transition in the global south. And I've had a terrific day. I'm learning a lot, but I'm also finding out that Africa is not very much at the center of these conversations. So before I introduce our distinguished panelists, I will give you a little context for our conversation. So Africa is already facing the consequences of climate change. We see it in the Horn of Africa in the 4 consecutive years of failed rains, which have left millions facing famine, uprooting, heading, and farming communities. We see it in the devastating floods in KwaZulu Natal and in Nigeria in 2022 that caused massive destruction to life and property. And I can multiply the examples. Africa faces the brunt of climate change, though it has contributed less than 3% of the global emission of greenhouse gases. I think John Kerry pointed out this morning that how many, 40 or 48 African countries have contributed 0.55%. The impact of climate change is being experienced across the global south. In the global south, the rising cost of servicing external debts has reduced countries' fiscal space and the ability to pursue climate action. Yet Africa is not without resources, and I like to repeat that. We're not a basket case. 60% of the world's unfarmed arable land is in Africa. And Africa has considerable mineral resources and oil and gas deposits. But Africa's economies remain largely extractive. The exploitation of its mineral wealth dominated by multinationals with very little manufacturing and decline in agricultural production. Africa is faced with the challenge of food security and development paths at a point in the global economy where the emphasis is on green economies and the transition to clean energy. In the last COP27 in Egypt, food was on the agenda, and how to balance food security against the challenge of deforestation. Considering the importance of primary forests in the Amazon and the Congo Basin to carbon sequestration, it is disturbing that in 2021, the Amazon of Brazil lost 1.5 million hectares of tropical primary forest. And another favorite place of mine, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, lost 500,000 hectares. Governments and communities in the global south face tough development and livelihood choices. According to the United Nations estimates, international finance flowing to the developing countries to facilitate climate adaptation programs, a concern at COP26, is 5 to 10 times lower than what is needed. To help us unpack the challenges of food security and greening Africa's economies, debt distress, and the limited fiscal space for internal climate financing, and the role of international finance in forging innovative solutions in green financing in Africa, we have with us 3 extremely qualified individuals. Dr. Agnes Kalibata, who is on the screen, who is the president for the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa and is former Rwandan Minister for Agriculture and Animal Resources. Then we have also on the screen, Professor Kevin Urama, who's the acting chief economist of the African Development Bank Group. And with us in person is Mr. Jake Levine, the Chief Climate Officer of the United States International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC. So they come from very different perspectives. So I thought we would start off by me asking them to state maybe 5, at most 7 minutes, how they see the issues we have raised or I have raised from their vantage point. And I think we'll start in that order with Dr. Agnes Kalibata from AGRA. We'll go to our chief economist from the African Development Bank, and then we'll come to Jake in person. And I've been learning a lot about what DFC is already doing in African countries. And then I'll moderate a conversation for a few minutes, and then we'll open up for you to ask your questions, because I think it is not often that we get a group like this in conversation. So let me turn to Dr. Agnes Kalibata, and I'll give you 5, at most 7 minutes, and I'll hold you to the time. Everybody, professors, do that, to share some reflections from your vantage standpoint. So thank you, Dr. Agnes Kalibata.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Can you hear me very well?
Yes, we do.
Very good. Sorry, I had to ask that. That happens when you're on the screen. Listen, I really appreciate the conversation that is happening here tonight, and I'm going to really emphasize the impact of this energy transition on food systems in the global south and how it's impacting food systems. And what needs to be happening as we talk about financing. And I'll probably leave the biggest part of financing to the other two experts on the call with me, to my fellow panelists. But when I look at the energy and food systems conversation that's happening here, it reminds me of the conversation that we had 2 years ago in the Food Systems Summit, where the out of 3 transitions the UN system was calling for, 2 transitions were the energy transition and food systems transition. Of course, the other was the digital transition, and we are seeing a whole lot that is happening in that area. But there's a very significant link between the energy and food systems transition that we just wanted to dive into a little bit so that you do understand what is at stake here. The current state of food systems in the world is definitely linked to energy. And you see that countries where food systems or where energy is largely available, where people are connected, where access is possible, food systems function. Food systems are stronger. So it's not surprising that in countries like in Africa, other developing parts of the world, where there's limited access to energy, the same countries are also have high incidences of food insecurity. So it's not by coincidence. It really one thing leads to the other. In parts of the world where we have significant energy, 30% of the energy is actually in food systems. 25% goes to production systems, ensuring mechanization, ensuring irrigation, and ensuring that all these technologies are available. 45%, whole 45% goes to of the 30% goes to processing and adding value. But the most important part of this processing and adding value is the stabilization of value chains, so that you have food all year round. You all live in places where they don't grow food all year round, but they have food all year round. And in Africa, where we have the ability to grow food all year round, we actually are not able to. Part of the problem is right there, the lack of access to energy. And what does that lack look like? In Africa, and mostly some of this is probably in North and a little bit further Southern Africa, only 4% energy is accessible in food systems. 4% of what is needed is accessible in food systems. So just think about what that means again, when you look at the implication of that to the production systems and how they become efficient, the amount of loss at harvest and in food systems, and the amount of loss when it comes to cold chains and inability to put cold chains in place. And then the increased vulnerability to climate change, and you started your conversation with talk on climate change. So the challenge here is that the catch-22, as you have seen it, is that as some of our countries try to catch up with the energy challenge, either they are using fossil fuels or they're using wood fuel, and they're contributing further to climate change. So how do we go about this problem? There are solutions. And I love the fact that you linked these two technologies. Today in Rwanda, for example, and in many other parts now in developing countries, you're seeing irrigation through solar systems becoming important. So that is increasing and stabilizing the ability of farmers to produce food all year round. You're seeing mini grids that are becoming local solutions and taking energy to local areas. And I'm sure the two financial institutions that are here have funded things like that. And you're seeing waste to power becoming extremely important and increasingly important. So solutions are available. The challenge goes to really the first word in this conversation, financing. Is financing available enough to help us transform and transition food systems and energy systems enough to help Africa deal with the challenge of food, especially in this increasing climate? And if we don't address the challenge of water in Africa, definitely climate change is going to be extremely harmful to people, and as we've seen in parts of Africa, as you have said. So what is the finance challenge that is in our midst? And again, I'll leave it to my colleagues, but I want to pick out two issues that I would like us all to think about. Everybody talks about rethinking financial instruments, and I really hope that this happens sooner than later. I've worked as a minister in a country. I've worked in development, and sometimes I ask myself, what is development if it is not to facilitate development? What's development financing if it's not to facilitate development? Our banking systems and financial systems are more concerned about the type of ratings they get than the type of development they put in place. Can we give them a break? Can we encourage them and put in place mechanisms that rate them based on the development initiatives they've helped the world access, helped the developing countries now part of the world access? That is something that has to be addressed. You can't talk development and then your hands are tied to deliver development. So that's point number one. Number two is this whole debt situation and access to adaptation financing. Adaptation financing is there in many of these institutions and is there in the Green Climate Fund. But what's the cost of accessing that money? For a country like mine or yours, if you come from Africa that is cash strapped or is living with debt after COVID-19. Those are two things that I need us to think through and really remember that the solutions to the climate crisis is within our midst. They are doable, but the financial instruments have to be available to private sector, to governments, to communities so that we can survive this. We can't have AAA ratings in an environment where people are dying. And again, I know this is not the problem of African Development Bank. I'm not pointing fingers. It's not the problem of World Bank. It's the problem of how we are set up. We need to prioritize development. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kalibata. Let me turn to Professor Urama. So 5 at most 7 minutes, if you can share your opening reflections.
Thank you very much, my brother, Professor Emmanuel. Thank you to the Harvard Salata Institute for inviting me to this very important conversation. My colleague Agnes has already laid out a few things. Let me just go straight to the financing issues that we have, especially with regard to financing what I would prefer to call just energy transitions in Africa. Because energy transition is one thing, but having a just energy transition that allows for growth to happen, poverty reduction to continue to happen, and all the other sustainable development goals to continue to be achieved on the continent is also crucial. But if we focus on energy alone, you find that energy sector is the area in Africa that is receiving the most climate financing. But that most climate financing is only $9.4 billion US that has been received annually. This is about 32% of the total climate finance that has come into the continent. But the total climate finance that has come into the continent from those figures already, you see, is far too short to be able to drive transition, whether it's in the energy sector or in the agriculture sector, the food system sector, health sector, or all the other sectors that are heavily impacted, which this conference has already highlighted quite a lot. So we estimate a gap of, almost 30 billion US dollars annually for financing green energy transition only in Africa. The most recent report from IEA puts that figure to be around 25 billion, which is an average of our own estimate, which is between 22 to 30 billion to be able to do that. And if we think about the big aspects in terms of financing, the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, to be able to meet the climate action targets of COP20 of the Paris Climate Agreement, we find more and more expanding gaps in terms of financing as well. In our AEO, African Economic Outlook Report of 2022, we were estimating around 1.3 to 2 billion trillion US dollars between now and 2022 to be able to meet the conditional nationally determined contributions on the continent. But with the more data coming in because of improvements in access to the data and other things, we're seeing that that figure could actually reach up to 2.7 trillion between now to 2030, which gives us a huge financing gap that is ranging between 127 billion annually to almost 200 billion annually. If you put this, juxtapose this to the amount of resources that's coming to the continent, which is still below 20 billion, you see that the financing gap is huge. Both Emmanuel and Agnes have already highlighted the issues around the constraining fiscal space on the continent and the imperative that it becomes almost clear that without external financing support, Africa is not going to be able to meet its nationally determined contributions. And I would say by extension, if Africa doesn't meet that climate action goals, the world will not meet those climate action goals as well. And we have many challenges in the current financing system that creates the problem and makes it really systemic and endemic. The first one is that the structure and the flow and the scale of climate financing is totally misaligned with climate vulnerability and climate risks. Our AEO report finds that the more vulnerable countries are, the less likely they are to be able to receive climate finance or any clean development mechanism. And this also extends to all types of development financing instruments because of the point that Agnes cleverly raised here with regard to the focus on risk ratings and the AAA ratings of countries. So because with more risks, with more vulnerability, higher risks are there, and then countries have higher cost of capital and accessing resources becomes even more challenging. So I will even go further from Agnes to say that the current system is actually discrediting development in itself in addressing all the other development goals. So we have multiple instruments that are now being deployed, and that's also creating trade-off risks because ODA resources are now becoming climate finance, used for climate financing, including debt instruments. Between 2010 and 2019, our estimations is that about 75% of all climate finance that came into the continent were debt instruments. And these are countries who are already worried about the debt vulnerability risks, and the physical impacts of climate change is deepening that vulnerability risk. So when they're having to take loans in order to address the impacts of climate change, that increases, it's just a vicious cycle that continues to deepen and deepen and deepen. So it's like a wild wind. So we need to really cleverly think about how to align the climate financing architecture with climate vulnerability and climate readiness. Because without it, it's going to be very difficult for countries in the developing South to be able to meet the climate goals. And if they don't, the global community will not be able to meet those goals. Let me stop there because of the time, and then we can come back during discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So let me turn to Jake. In our earlier conversations today, you mentioned how there are trillions of dollars being invested in the clean energy. Clearly, from what Kevin and from what Agnes are pointing out, it looks like this money is not flowing into Africa or not at considerable levels. Both pointed out the perception of risk in Africa as a risky place. But I know DFC is doing interesting things. So I'll let you share your 5-7 minutes reflection, and then we'll have a conversation.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Kevin and Agnes. Good to see you from afar, but really appreciated your thoughts as we think about framing this discussion. And I appreciate your question, Professor, because I think it is worth sort of zooming out for a moment, thinking about, how to connect this discussion to so much of what we've heard at this conference over the last 24 hours. And when you think about the Biden administration's sort of thesis or theory of the case on climate, and this applies to the US domestic policy and it applies to our work internationally, it is organized around a central theme that the single most meaningful capital formation event of our lifetimes, of this generation, the single largest as a measure of magnitude investment opportunity that we have in front of us is the energy transition that we're living through today. This is manifest in the Inflation Reduction Act domestically, in the CHIPS Act, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, which together will represent more than $1 trillion. I think depending on different models and studies, we have sort of leveraged magnitudes in the multiple trillions of dollars of investments in clean energy. And that organizing principle, that economic principle, is the same one that animates the work that we do at the Development Finance Corporation and the work that the US government is driving on development and international finance overseas, which is to say that climate rises to the top amongst many priorities, including healthcare, gender equity, digital connectivity, financial inclusion. But climate rises to the top because it animates the single largest investment opportunity that we're living through in our time. And this is an opportunity to not only, as Kevin noted, invest in the energy sector, but it's across the board. It's the complete wholesale remaking of the transportation sector in terms of the electrification and decarbonization of vehicles. It's the way that we power and run our buildings, electrification, energy efficiency, and so on. It's in the work that we're doing to monetize and value and price in the inherent value of nature, which is a subject so close to the sort of the core of many of these issues that we find across the continent. And it's in the work to decarbonize our industrial base so that we're producing low carbon cement, steel inputs, green hydrogen, and so on. And I think, I wanted to sort of zoom out, but then really go deep in. And we had talked about a couple of specific jurisdictions, and I think that they provide a contrast that's instructive. One is Kenya, and another is Congo, which you mentioned. So take Kenya, for example, where DFC has, among nearly $1 billion of investment, two very exciting projects that we've recently worked on. One is a wind power farm south of Nairobi called the Kipeto Power Station. And one is a geothermal station north of Nairobi, about 3 hours north of Nairobi in the Rift Valley. They're similar in size and they're similar in function. And they are two projects that are helping Kenya to create what is a 93% zero emission electric grid. Now, there's a whole off-grid sector of the Kenyan power grid, which is run on diesel and dirty fuels, and that is important to not ignore. But I want to recognize that on the grid, Kenya has a 93% carbon-free electricity sector, which is now drawing in hundreds of millions of dollars of industrial investment into Nairobi, into some of the industrial zones that Kenya has designated because of the pressures that corporations are feeling on their scope 2 emissions. They want to have zero emissions. And Kenya has recognized that they can attract business, they can attract investment, some of this $23 trillion opportunity that we see in the energy transition to build things there based on renewable energy. I'm having a conversation tomorrow morning with the president of the Kipeto project, who wants to figure out what should he do with all of the overgeneration of power that he's curtailing at night. And he's thinking about green hydrogen, he's thinking about carbon sequestration, he's thinking about energy storage. The possibilities are endless, and it leads to a really interesting policy conversation about not just encouraging the just energy transition to net zero, but going beyond that to net negative and compensating African countries that are better positioned in many cases than any other countries on Earth to deliver net negative carbon reductions in the overall system. Now you contrast that with the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has a country that is among the 10 poorest in the world by some measures, by others maybe among the top 5. But by other measures is among the richest in the world in terms of its natural resources, both forest and nature-based resources and mineral wealth under the surface. And is a country at the same time that has 70% of its population without any access to any electricity at all. And in Congo, we're focused on a few different things. It's very different than Kenya, where we're having conversations with electric mobility companies that are innovating and trying to build off of this zero emissions grid. In Kenya, we're working with distributed renewable energy providers who are innovating on not just pay-as-you-go models, but on full-on metro grid and microgrid models to build distribution electricity companies out of nothing. And there's a real business case to do that. We're talking with companies that have been stewards of the natural environment, forestry companies in particular, who are now very focused on bringing their business model to bear against what is a devastating sort of endemic challenge with deforestation that is sort of driven by the need to produce charcoal for heating and cooking for homes. And we're working with those companies to think about how they can monetize that carbon resource. And of course, we're really interested also in the critical mineral base there and in supporting Congo and also its neighbors, in particular Zambia, to develop a value chain for its critical minerals that doesn't just tell the same story of extraction, export, and exploitation, but helps to build in processing, refining, finished products, and manufacturing so that Congo can actually capture the value of that industry. And so you see, I mean, I think it's helpful to go deep and specific into each market because the heterogeneity of challenges that different countries are grappling with throughout Africa is quite pronounced. And you see different challenges, but different opportunities that sort of can match up with each of those countries. We won't get to talk about all of them, but I do just want to conclude, I may have blown through the 5 to 7 minutes, but I do just want to conclude on one point that both Agnes and Kevin noted, and sort of phrase it in another way, which is that the cost of investing and the cost of doing business in Africa is outrageously and artificially high. And there is an added premium that investors pay based purely on the cost of capital that is required to borrow. And this is where DFC comes into the picture because we provide tools, financial tools, whether that's insurance, whether that's a guarantee, whether that is a debt product, but a debt product that comes in at a concessional or blended rate that is not available by the commercial markets to bring that cost of capital down and to break down that barrier of perceived risk so that we can then build up a track record and volume of investment that can show investors and capital markets and really private sector investors who have the $1 trillion of balance sheets to bring to bear on this problem, that investing in Africa is a winning business proposition and is one that will ultimately deliver returns.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. So, Jay, let me ask a question that goes to all three of you. In an earlier panel today, I was being informed of how private capitalists or billionaire philanthropists had been among the pioneers in things like carbon removal. Someone like Richard Branson, before the US government would follow in their footsteps. As we look at Africa, Africa is not without its billionaires. They are not as numerous, but they are there. And they are people with significant private wealth. So I'm trying to see how we bring international finance, including those with public resources, multilateral development organizations, what role for African governments, the African private sector, and communities. So how do we create an infrastructure that brings these together when we talk about financing Africa's energy transition? So maybe we can start with you, Jake, and then we can go to the screen, and then we'll have Dr. Kalibata and Professor Urama also share some comments. And I think after that, I see how our time is going. I will open up for us to take some questions from the audience. So please, Jake.
Well, there's no shortage of opportunities for billionaires to get involved. We can think of some, I think, that would be ripe. And to be fair, there are several billionaire-led African-based corporations that are at the leading edge of the kind of innovation that you want to see. For example, sort of having pioneered a technological leapfrog, to use a term that I've heard here already a couple times today, in the telecom space and in the development of wireless and digital infrastructure to skip over the needs for so much wired infrastructure and move into a cell-based future, which has led to a whole host of innovations. I think about, for example, the M-Pesa case study, where you've got a vibrant digital currency basically operating throughout the continent that has created a tremendous amount of financial inclusion, has been enabled by that wireless infrastructure. And those companies are now getting involved in the decarbonization of their own assets and their own supply chains, but also recognizing the enormous business opportunity of distributed renewable energy, as opposed to sort of the centralized model that you see having proliferated in so many other places around the world. But I think the thing that I wanted to mention more directly in response to your question is we are working on platforms with the philanthropic community, with leaders from the Rockefeller Foundation to Bezos to IKEA, the Shell Foundation and others, including many who have actually formed a really interesting kind of platform for philanthropic donors called the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, something known as GAP, which is working on the concept of blended finance. And I think this is a concept that has now the moment has arrived for this concept. People will be familiar with this concept in finance, and it is one that has gotten a lot of play. But we're now seeing, and DFC has itself now been able to deploy philanthropic capital sort of at a first loss basis, or even at just a pure grant basis, in a blended structure with DFC finance and in many cases with other private equity investment that brings down the overall cost of capital of a transaction and creates the bankability of that transaction, which would not have previously ever happened. We have a partnership specifically with Rockefeller and Shell, to which they have committed $50 million for distributed renewable energy projects across Africa, and it is intended to mobilize up to $2 billion of DFC finance. And for a long time, it's been difficult, candidly, for us to find the projects that would be supported by this commitment. But we have now been able to build the infrastructure to hire the staff and to go to the markets and essentially sell this product and this offering that we're seeing a lot of interest in our pipeline. And so I think that there is a ready sort of set of players who would happily work with the philanthropies and the billionaires. And a big part of that work is just the connectivity and making sure that everybody is talking to each other and that they're aware of those opportunities.
Thank you. Dr. Kalibata, the role of government, private sector, communities in this transition, if you could share some thoughts.
No, thank you. I mean, based on what you heard Kevin say, there's huge perceived risk of doing business in Africa, but I guess that risk gets even more amplified when we talk about investing in food systems in Africa. So the need to reassure investors, the need to put in place mechanisms and policies that make it possible for people to actually believe that these areas are investable, or that Africa's food system is investable, is extremely important. So governments have a huge role to make it possible for businesses to come in through policies and through, finding ways of just chipping away at some of those challenges that sit in the system and making sure that those challenges are removed. And again, a good example is the ease of doing business that worked for many countries a while ago. They were working with the World Bank, and there are other forms of ease of doing business. What this did was actually identify these challenges and have an intentional plan to take these challenges out of the system. I think that worked well, and just ensuring that governments identify some of those areas that tend to be roadblocks is really important. The other is finding incentives, actual incentives that make it possible for private sector to exist. And our colleague in DFC is talking about how GIA and other instruments that are now in place make it possible for them to invest. But African governments are actually doing that by going to African Development Bank and borrowing money that gets put in the system to de-risk investments in solar energy, as you see in some countries, investment in mini grids by private sector, match them, find ways of blending finance from that perspective, make it possible for communities to engage. These are all investments that governments are making. Can more be done? I'm 100% sure that they can do more, but I think that there are opportunities that governments can double down on. Communities, in terms of investing and ensuring that they participate in finding solutions, there are a number of things that communities can do, especially if the products and proof of concept for these products have been done. We also need to look at communities and farmers as investors. They're not going to do businesses where they lose money. But every time concepts have been proven, you actually find communities engaging. And again, there are a few good examples around waste to energy that is beginning to happen around different communities, around mini grids that can actually be local solutions and that can facilitate local engagement. And in some cases, these models are already there. I wanted to end on this point, on the point that philanthropy is actually significantly engaged. I mean, we are in this space as AGRA with the significant investment because it is coming from philanthropy, whether it is Rockefeller Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Mastercard Foundation, and many others. So philanthropy is on top of the game and working with others to try to find solutions. But there's also African philanthropy. And the other day, I was just thrilled to see that there's $9 billion of money in the African philanthropy space that is available for private sector, for communities, institutions to tap into and contribute to development itself. So a number of opportunities exist. And if you don't mind, Emmanuel, this is going to be my last question because this is approaching midnight and I'm going to go to sleep.
I understand that. So let me have Kevin share, also respond, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So if with the permission of the audience, I think we can excuse Dr. Agnes Kalibata. It's midnight in Nairobi, and she can go to bed. So thank you very much for joining us, for staying up this late to join us. So, asante sana.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kevin?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Emmanuel, and thank you, colleagues. This is a very interesting discussion. So it's what's sitting up at midnight for my sister. First, for me, the whole issue around mobilizing the private sector, unfortunately, Agnes has left with regard to the enthusiasm we always have about innovative instruments and technologies and so on. I'll come at it a little bit with some form of cautious optimism. First, when I try to look at innovative mechanisms that has been used for greening economies over time, for the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, for example, Africa assessed only 10% of the resources that was earmarked for that. For the same reasons that I raised, the structure of the financing, the scale of the financing, and how it's aligned to vulnerabilities and capabilities. So I will come to that in terms of government, what governments and the private sector needs to do. We're also now very enthused about sustainability bonds, green bonds, and sustainability-linked bonds, debt for nature swap. There are so many instruments that we, even at the African Development Bank, are trying to develop. But if you still look at it, of all these green bonds globally, Africa is assessing only 0.3%. And when you think about green loans, it's about 1.9%. When you think about sustainability bonds, it's less than 1%. So that doesn't give me the optimism that without looking at the fundamentals in terms of how the structure is now and reform how MDBs, DFIs, philanthropies, and other financiers support development and what we focus on, even the underlying models of how we're doing them, I think Africa will still continue and the global south will continue to be disadvantaged. Now, let me come to the actual question in terms of what the private sector governments can do. Of course, we know how the private sector engages, the modus operandi for the private sector. We need to try as African governments to address the huge information asymmetries and knowledge gaps that exists in Africa's clean development and green transitions markets. Many African countries, as you have already highlighted it in the concept note, really holds the key for the green transition. Lithium-ion batteries, cobalt, and all those things, most of the minerals are in Africa. How do we address that information and knowledge gaps, including how to turn those assets into natural capital into wealth for development, to address poverty and address all these structural transformation issues that is blocking transitions on the continent and increasing the heightened risks that we have all talked about with regard to the private sector. Now, addressing the risks, we talk quite a lot about risk mitigation and so on. Again, cautious optimism for me, because I see quite a lot of trying to think that MDBs should socialize green risks to accelerate green investments, but then the private sector will privatize the gains. That's not sustainable in the end, because the capital adequacy of these MDBs and the long-term sustainability of the MDBs also needs to be put into question. So there needs to be massive focus on increasing, concessional financing windows that goes to addressing these fragilities we know will affect people, poverty, women, children, and also our global planet in terms of the possibility of the being able to do the transition that we need. But in the energy sector, since Agnes has addressed agriculture, there are specific structural issues that affect private sector participation in renewable energy markets that we also need to think about. The long-term horizon of many climate projects is something that we need to think about. Underdeveloped financial sector is something that governments need to think about, but this also requires investments to be able to build the institutions and the regulatory systems that will allow that to work. And also, quite often, there's a lot of competing priorities in several ministries in Africa. And we need to start thinking about climate and not just another development goal, but actually a cross-cutting issue that the finance ministers, the central banks, and so on needs to think about and be able to move forward with. And that is why we need to start thinking more holistically and more in-depth about these issues. My main challenge in the green conversations we have been having since the 1970s is that we seem to be making a similar mistake of just narrow focus on greening and not thinking about greening as a development objective. Because without that, we see trade-offs. And once there are trade-offs within poverty, environment, and climate and other things, of course, people will choose short-term goals, which is address the immediate poverty issues, put people out of the streets, and so on and so forth. And that will also have implications for how much investments can go to the greening goals that we're all keeping in mind. So what I'm really calling for is a major rethinking, and this is the role of research. The role, the Salata Institute, colleagues in Harvard, and African Development Bank, World Bank, we really all need to put on our thinking hats and think differently at how we model development and not be incremental in our approaches of just thinking of how do we come with innovations to improve the current financial architecture. Maybe it's time to think about changing it.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Why don't we take questions from the audience? So I hear you don't need a mic, so let me start there, and then I'll come to the middle, and then I'll come to the right, and I'll repeat, because we Africans are very democratic. I start.
Okay. Fully agree.
I'm Amit Bando, and I'm from Ceres. We work with institutional investors, companies, and policymakers, largely US-based, on many of these issues that you're talking about. And so I had, I guess, two broad questions. One, as I look at the title here, we're talking about financing energy transitions in the global south. And I wonder how what you're talking about in Africa can sort of benefit from what's going on elsewhere in the global south, because I don't think we heard anything about that. And I know that the DFC and others, you are doing a lot of work all over, and there are many lessons to be learned that I know, and I imagine you know. So I wonder how you are connecting those. And secondly, the broader issue of energy transition, and we've touched on the fact that we have to look at food security and use of energy in other sectors, very well taken. But there's also the additional need for sort of macroeconomic transformations of the economies, looking at things like the inflation rate, the fact that a lot of the risk, while it may be perceived, but there are certain very actual risks that are perhaps particularly unique to Africa, and have been tackled elsewhere. So what are the, again, lessons learned and the ability to transfer some of what's gone on elsewhere? How are you thinking about it, and what could and should be done? Of course, I ask this from the perspective of an institutional investor wanting to invest in Africa which a lot of them do, particularly impact investors. Of course, you've talked about of the billionaires. They all want to look at returns, not necessarily commercial returns right away, but to the extent that you address some of these larger issues, I think you're looking at a better risk-reward ratio.
So we'll let our responses be brief. So we'll start with Jake, and then we'll go to Kevin, and then I'll come to the middle, and so we can squeeze as many questions as possible. Please.
So there's lots of great questions in there. Today we announced a big transaction in Ecuador, which was a debt restructuring, which is maybe the best tool that we have to address some of the structural issues that you raised outside of a pure project-based financing. We provide political risk insurance. This is the largest ever debt for nature conversion done. And we've now done a few of these at scale. And the headline numbers are that we will provide $656 million of political risk insurance to help Ecuador essentially reduce its national debt by $1.12 billion. And that deal will create debt service payments that will be channeled into programmatic protections of the coastal environment in the Galapagos, which embedded into that includes a number of really creative things like 11 different private insurance companies providing more than 50% of the deal value in reinsurance through interesting and innovative structures like parametric insurance. And you start to bring in institutional asset owners into an emerging market economy on a transaction that's reducing national debt, but also creating payments and pricing for nature. We love these transactions, and we're gonna, knock on wood, do a few of them on the African continent, but it's tough to talk about them before they're ripe because it sort of spooks the bond market. I do wanna just quickly mention that we have started to see in some of our more mature transactions, especially in the energy sector, interest from institutional investors because they see steady, good, stable returns. It's not something that we're traditionally in the business of doing in terms of helping to finance, taking out DFC or DFI financing or MDB financing and having it refinanced by institutional investors, but we have recently done it, including last year in a transaction in Egypt, where we financed what we called a green note on a several years old solar park transaction that we had originally financed that then enabled for reinvestment and reduction in cost of capital and some returns for a Japanese and a Canadian pension fund who came into that transaction. And it was kind of the first time that we were aware that you had Asian institutional investors looking for emerging market risk in Africa. So that's the kind of thing that we want to be seeing a lot more of. I agree with Kevin's broader point that in order to get more of that, we sort of need to rethink some of the structural constraints around that. Another really big one that you didn't mention but was implicit in some of your questions is local currency and foreign exchange risk, where unless you have some outside capital to finance the hedging or to somehow loan in local currency, it's very difficult to manage that risk.
Kevin, any comments to add? And then I'll take the next question.
Yes, please. For me, I think you have hit on you have hit the nail on the head in terms of this reference to macroeconomic transformation, because governance is at the center of the risks and the risk perceptions we have in Africa and everywhere else. And linking this to the question you just asked before, in terms of what philanthropies and the private sector can do, I think we need to continue not to move away from financing, supporting capacity development supporting the knowledge work that is required in order to be able to build these capacities on this on the continent and also across the global south. If you look at the data, you find that the focus on governance was improving across the continents in Africa before COVID. But since COVID and because of the this rebranding of everything to climate, everything to green, there's a lot more interest now in project financing for these green projects, which themselves may become non-performing loans in the end if we don't have the good macroeconomic framework within countries. So there's quite big attention being paid by the bank on public financial management, and that is why we established the Africa Public Financial Management Academy. There's quite a lot of interest being paid on reforming the macroeconomic governance, e-governance, transparency, accountability, because the more we get this done, we are de-risking the market explicitly. And that's a longer-term de-risking than just the issue of giving risk guarantees to allow private sector to come in, which I said sometimes it depends on the scale. It's necessary, but it may not. It's not just the silver bullet. So we need to try and address the root causes of the problems. How are we learning from what's going on elsewhere in the global south? Of course, there's quite a lot of twinning that goes on between in the South-South cooperation collaboration frameworks, and both between institutions, but also between countries to learn what is going on. And in this particular area of green transitions, this is an area that there's quite a lot that can be learned. And again, that requires facilitating such. So philanthropies could also, my call is I would try to, support some of those fundamental transition of what I call the drivers of the transition instead of just focusing on the projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Now now I have 4. Why don't we take 2 very short questions? So you in the front, and then at the 4th row, so that we do both south and north. So you in the front, and then we'll take a question from this, and we'll have 3 on the table, and then you give us brief responses, because I know we started a little late, but we have a 5 o'clock event. So, Madam.
Sure, I'm Valerie Grant. I'm a portfolio manager at Nuveen. And my question is to both of the gentlemen here. That term leapfrog, and I'm trying to understand how relevant it is to the challenge before us. I'm reasonably familiar with the telecommunications leapfrog that occurred in sub-Saharan Africa and the wealth that was generated for some, but also the economic growth that was stimulated. Is there an analogy there to what we're confronting now with the issues related to climate change? I think maybe there are some in some areas, but not others, but I would appreciate both of your perspectives in that regard.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Ratnika Prasad, and I work for the Nature Conservancy on innovative financing mechanisms. We've talked a lot about energy projects today, and there's a certain element of technological innovation and that drives a lot of private capital interest, which is a precursor for us to think about things like blended finance. But a big challenge in Africa, as Agnes and Kevin talked about, is also land use change. I'm just curious if you're coming across projects in your portfolio that have a slightly more private sector bend when it comes to land use change, or if it largely remains carbon credit kind of deals as we've seen in the past.
And then, yes, Rob.
Yeah, I had a question about rural power for irrigation in African agriculture. Africa has abundant groundwater resources, largely untapped for irrigation, in part because rural electricity to handle the pumps is either too expensive or not available. Would a move towards solar-powered irrigation pumps be an attractive leapfrog technology to get off the grid completely, deep into rural areas? And if so, who would finance that?
Thank you. So, why don't we start on the screen? So let's go to Kevin, because I suspect when we come to you, we'll be coming close to the end and we can use you to sum up. So, Kevin, we have to.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, okay. Okay. So the question on, are you hearing me?
Very well.
Okay. So the question on leapfrogging is an important one, and the role of technology in doing that. Of course, technology and innovation has always been the driver of changes in different industrial revolutions that we have, and this aspect of green transition is not different. So in Africa and also the developing world, my focus is how to ensure that Africa and the developing South does not lose out in building the capacity to be able to become part of the technology producers. Because rents, of course, goes to the owners of the IP. And in the end, if we continue the same model where the technologies are produced in the global north and increasingly in China and other places and exported to Africa, we lose two opportunities. One, the opportunity to be able to build capacity in the countries where the raw materials for these technologies are. And then the second one, to reduce the carbon footprint in our value chains, in our trade value chains. Because moving raw materials from one country to the other and moving back the produced product actually makes some of the green technologies not really fully green. So we can change the model of how the technologies are done through a lot of policies like franchising or local content policies. So that leapfrogging can then happen so that it's not just leapfrogging in a short distances that a frog can do, but we can actually have a jet flight in terms of moving faster to the green transition that we're trying to achieve, because we reduce CO2 emissions and we also increase the capacity of countries, increase the fiscal space to finance transitions in these poorer countries, but also create jobs and reduce other fragilities that the impacts on the forest ecosystems because of firewood. And there's a lot of net flows and reflows that happen if we do that in that way. And solar-powered pumps for irrigation will really be a game changer, especially addressing the projected impacts of climate change. Not even projected, we're already seeing it in the agricultural systems in Africa and in the developing world, as Agnes has clearly articulated. But how that is financed depends then on the business model that is used and how we are developing, whether we are buying those solar power irrigation pumps externally and so on. This again, linked to my first response, defines its impact on poverty, its impact on the bottom line. Because one thing I didn't mention is that if we did that, producing technologies where the raw materials for them are, we also reduce the costs in terms of the logistic costs for the businesses. So it's good for business, it's good for climate, it's also good for development. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll try to be very brief. So the best leapfrogs I think that we have are in the power sector and in the cooking sector, where you're seeing opportunities for new technology, new entrants in terms of just basic technology upgrades to eliminate the need for entire systems of infrastructure that you would have had to have before. So I mentioned metro grids in Congo. Another area that we're really interested in is clean cook stoves, which are possible both in terms of greater efficiency and cleaner cooking stoves that use traditional biomass, and also solar and in some cases LPG technology. The LPG technology is a little bit more complicated on the leapfrog concept because you're introducing some infrastructure in that regard. I think the solar for water pumps is another great example of opportunity for leapfrogging, and totally agree with Kevin's response to that question. I think this is another area where we're trying to build in lessons from other jurisdictions where we work, in India in particular, where we have had some success in supporting solar for water irrigation, also in Indonesia, which has a slightly different challenge, but in its island nation structure is heavily reliant on diesel infrastructure for mobile power sources. And they have embarked on a de-dieselization effort that is government-led and supported with enabling and regulatory frameworks that incentivize that. And I think that with similar supports, you could see a proliferation of solar technology for water irrigation in Africa. But that also leads to the last point, which is that these are tougher businesses to finance. DFC has seen some degree of active deal flow in the ag and regenerative forestry space. I'm not sure I would go as far as to say really land use from that sort of broader perspective. But when you talk about increasing food productivity, production, including technological upgrades around sensing and smart water irrigation and fertilizer and chemistry sensing technologies, and also sort of geospatial imaging and mapping to detect similar concentrations of water and fertilizer. That is an area where we're seeing growth. It's an area where we're trying to spur more growth. So at COP27, we announced a call for applications for something that we're calling adaptation SMEs, small and medium enterprises, focused in ag, healthcare, infrastructure, and water. And the idea there really is to do sort of a market pulse and understand what is happening in the private sector, because as you indicate, in some of these non-energy sector, non-transportation, non-infra, where there's less of a clear revenue model, it's harder to find those business opportunities. But we think that we've so far gotten a pretty decent response and would welcome the chance to partner with TNC on that, as we have in other areas.
We've gone beyond our time, so why don't you join me in thanking our speakers, Kevin from Abidjan, Jake from Preston, and a clap for all of you for making this